A while ago, I had a video out called The Struggle Against Academic Censorship, which was based on a problem I'd been having with the marketing department of my publisher, Cornell University Press. I'll link to that video in the description below. But now I wanted to expand on that discussion and deal with censorship and groupthink. I also want to ask, how does academic groupthink affect society as a whole? This is something I've written about in the past, and with the conservative shift that we're currently experiencing here in America, and to some degree in the West as a whole, I thought that now would be a good time to revisit this issue. But I'll start off with a little bit of an anecdote here. So this one time I was sitting in a faculty lounge at the college where I was teaching at the time, and I had a copy of the ancient Greek New Testament in front of me. I was preparing to teach my students the Koine dialect of ancient Greek through the book of John, which is a fairly common exercise for this particular dialect, and a colleague of mine walked by and glanced at the book. He said with a bit of a sniff, "Ah yes, have fun teaching them all about resentment." So he was implying that the foremost characteristic of Christianity is resentment. But what I thought was most interesting about this event is that my colleague simply assumed that I despised Christianity as much as he did, even though I was quite new at the college and he barely knew me. This was a clear example of the ideological incubation in academia that leads to groupthink. I often used to notice that the longer almost anyone had been in academia, the more hostile he became to contrary opinions, because the longer he had been shielded away from them. This is why, to counter a common misconception, the oppressive and totalitarian tendencies of academia over the last several decades are mainly the fault of the professors, not the students. To give another example, when I was newly arrived at a particular teaching position, a colleague had suggested to me that we avoid certain subjects and issues since the college in question was a cosmopolitan one with students from all over the world representing lots of different cultures. I repeated this actually to the students themselves, without of course mentioning the name of the colleague, and the students were in emphatic agreement with me that they should be treated and spoken to as adults and not as children who are incapable of handling certain ideas. Similarly, I've had to explain to colleagues in various places, not to students who again by and large have agreed with me, that it's a fool's errand to avoid literature with uncomfortable subjects in it so as not to offend anyone who may have gone through that in real life. And that's because the human mind is so complex that anyone who's actually been through a horrible ordeal will be reminded of it by things that to others have nothing to do with it, but that to the victim triggers a chain of associations that lead to the memory of the event. So forbidding certain literature because it contains uncomfortable subjects is doubly foolish. First, it censors literature, which is bad enough in and of itself. And second, it vastly underestimates the complexity of the human mind. For example, one time somebody mentioned to me that he liked the city of Vancouver. And when I heard that, I immediately thought of dying in a plane crash. The reason is that once, when I myself was in Vancouver, the first thing I remember seeing upon my arrival was a seaplane landing on the water, and it looked rather choppy and dangerous. And so by these very quick associations, the human mind jumps between seemingly unrelated things. Much of the work of Proust, of course, is precisely about this issue and about the effect that certain physical sensations have on memory. But I guess many of my colleagues hadn't read Proust because they thought, erroneously, that not mentioning certain things might stop these associations from occurring. The students, for the most part, are young and impressionable, and one can understand how they might fall victim to the prejudices of the day. It is the professors who don't even try to guide them out of those prejudices who are guilty of dereliction of duty. When students are offended by material they receive, they are empowered in their dismay only by cowardly faculty who back down or who fail to inspire them into seeing more of the larger picture. If professors refused to self-censor, the problem would be much less acute because aggrieved students would notice that they don't have the power to cause changes in the material. And that's because it should be an axiom of human behavior that power leads to the need to exercise it. And the more power such students have, the more aggrieved and offended they will become. If professors and administrators took away their power by refusing to self-censor, the number of offended students would rapidly dwindle. That is, because the students would notice that they have no power, they would in fact become less offended. But, as is so often the case, academics look for conformity more than for anything else, even though they teach and praise the works of those who, by doing what they did, were anything but conformists. That is to say, academics hate in the living what they love in the dead. And this is where we are in terms of academic groupthink. The rise of academic censorship over the last half-century or so was given its biggest boost in the 1970s. The young ruffians of those days, who are these days as tenured professors, drew some of their moral relativism from an abuse of Wittgenstein's quite sensible philosophy of language and rejection of Cartesianism. To Wittgenstein, in the Philosophical Investigations, words are parts of language games, so-called Sprachspiele in German, and they gain their meaning from how they are used in social contexts. That then made it easier for academics to insist that concepts and words are linguistic constructs used to establish a particular hierarchy and to subordinate certain groups of people, and that so-called truths merely represent individual interests. They fail to understand that all human activity, including their own, is interest-based, and that the conclusion that ideas are power structures is therefore a trivial truth. But once this individual-based relativism has been established in academia as doggedly as it has, the only higher law possible can be that of the personal emotion, which of course is very empowering for students. And so there is a feedback loop in which the groupthink of the professors perpetuates groupthink among the students, which in turn pressures the few holdouts among the professors to conform to the general groupthink. While the groupthink cowardice of the faculty have at least a philosophical basis, weak though it may be, the groupthink cowardice of the administrators is more financial. The university has become a business that aims to make as much money as possible, and the more wealthy students can be recruited, the better for the business. I once heard an American diversity officer lament the fact of rising tuitions, apparently oblivious to the fact that his own six-figure salary was partly responsible for it. When politicians, usually on the left, declare that everyone should try to obtain a college degree, they not only devalue the degree itself, but they also devalue the people without a degree, which is unfortunate since manual labor also has dignity and usefulness, far more so, in fact, than the labor of a diversity officer. When students are pandered to for commercial reasons, the pedestal upon which they are placed rises even higher, and what professors say to them must therefore be monitored all the more, because if you drive away a lot of wealthy students, you make less money. All of this creates an atmosphere where the independent-minded are driven away. And this is how academic groupthink affects society as a whole. The limitations in thinking that have become common in academia become formative for the growing segments of society that pass through college. It therefore becomes increasingly difficult in society at large to have normal conversations with people who think differently. Because people have been insufficiently exposed to contrary viewpoints in academia, they become unable to handle these in the world at large, which of course causes ever more polarization in society. I live in New York City, for example, which of course is a left-wing stronghold, although there are pockets of sanity still, if you know where to go. And I can't tell you how many times I have caused absolute outrage by even the most innocuous remarks. As I once told my students on one of my last days as a professor, there are far more things that I could have said in the classroom then that would have gotten me fired than there were in, say, the 1950s. The students understood this and welcomed aggressive discussion. If we are to overcome the poisonous legacy of the 1960s and 70s, it is today's students, who will one day be professors themselves, who must lead the way. And there is in fact a special opportunity here in the present historical moment, because in many places now we see young people rising in conservative rebellion against their elders. This should absolutely be encouraged, even though it should also be understood for what it is, namely a rebellion, which will one day turn in the other direction yet again. Thank you so much for watching and for listening.